Um, so good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Suzanne Heron. I'm the Seroptimist Governor of the Western Canada region. And together with Governor Gertrude Hawk of the Eastern Canada region, we are hosting this webinar. And I apologize in advance if I come across not great at any time, because our internet is by satellite and it's raining here and that usually interferes. So, but I will soldier on. So I'd like to just begin by acknowledging and thanking the Indigenous peoples of these lands, past, present, and future, for their stewardship, care, and leadership on these lands that we meet on, and to acknowledge that we are guests on these lands, and we give thanks to the ancestors, the leaders, the matriarchs, the creatures, big and small, for looking after the rich resources and the cultural teachings of this beautiful land. I want to say a special hello to some of the folks who I know are here, our presenters, Kaya Robinson, Denise, I know you as Denise Pictou, and Patricia Whitefoot. Sharon Fisher, the immediate past president of Seroptimist International, our global organization, is here. Rosemary Reed, I see Rosemary and Sharon are past presidents of our federation, Seroptimist International of the Americas. And I'm delighted to see Wanda Price here. Wanda is the advocacy representative of SIA to Seroptimist International. So we're going to start with some throat singing by Nikki, I'm not going to say this well, Kamat Slutiksak, and her daughter, Chastity Swan. And they are celebrating their Inuit culture and honoring Nikki's cousin, Jessica Michaels, who was also a renowned throat singer, who died in 2001. And Governor Gertrude is going to cue that up for us.
Sorry, Suzanne, I had the wrong one here. Is it okay if we keep on listening to this one? It's a special song, also in acknowledgement of the passing throat singer. Otherwise, we would have to look at some commercials, and I don't want that. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Sorry about that.
Thank you so much for playing that, Gertrude. Get us in a frame of mind. A few housekeeping details. Please mute yourselves and use the chat for questions, appreciation, comments. And our moderator, Colleen Penrelli, will be monitoring it just to make sure there isn't anything inappropriate in there. Last time, we heard about some of the complexities and the issues of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Amber Silversmith showed us a timeline from a single Six Nations community. And to imagine that amplified to include all of Turtle Island was heavy. We heard about the problems of jurisdiction, law enforcement arriving too late, not taking disappearances seriously enough. We spoke about colonialism, the aftermath of the cultural genocide of residential schools, and the intersection of many issues, in particular, in the last several years of the ongoing drug crisis. So this time we are going to focus on going forward. What can we do? And our first presenter is Kaya Robinson. She's a human rights lawyer and a former commissioner on Canada's National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls. Born in Iqaluit, she was a senior policy advisor to the, and Kaya, I'm not going to say this right, Kikagkani Inuit Association, and a Crown prosecutor in Iqaluit. And Kaya told me that she was, as a girl, she was gifted her name by a family who had just lost an uncle of that name. And so she said, because they never would speak to him in English, they never spoke to her in English. And so she said, in addition to getting a name, I got a language, and carries that with her. She has spoken at TEDx and numerous other places about the cost of inaction and the weight of the long history of silence surrounding the struggles of the Indigenous community, encouraging everyone to speak up and speak out. And we've asked her to speak about her experience with the Commission, her learnings, and her perspective on implementation of the recommendations. And it's very timely that in the last week, CBC, our Canadian national broadcasting system, has put out a series on the follow-up to the recommendations. So Kaya, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you all for being here today and inviting us to be in this space with you and to have this conversation. I'll sort of build on the introduction, who I am a bit. I think it's really important. Although I was born and raised in the North and I have an Inuktitut name, my ancestry is non-Indigenous. I am a non-Indigenous woman. My father is of English descent. My mom was French Canadian. I realized as a kid growing up in the North that the gifts of language and name and in community and kinship that I have often gets confused as being part of it, the Indigenous, having an Indigenous identity. And in this era where I think Indigenous identity fraud, one, has become very lucrative and pervasive, I really think it's important for me to situate and properly introduce myself. I also come to this work as an ally, as an advocate, and as a woman and as a Canadian who sees my role in this work as being an ally, but perhaps more so an accomplice. So when I talk about my role and what I think many of us need to be doing, it's that work of being an accomplice. And I see myself as being an accomplice to people like Denise, who I will keep my presentation short because I believe that it is her knowledge, lived experience, and wisdom and perspective that must guide us, and is ultimately one of the biggest lessons that I've learned in the inquiry, or from the inquiry. My what I bring to this conversation is really my experience as one of the commissioners, one of the 4 commissioners that oversaw Canada's national inquiry into murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. The inquiry was launched in September of 2016, and it was really the first of its kind. We've had some royal commissions in Canada, but this was unique in that, in addition to having a mandate from the federal government, we had a mandate from all provinces and territories. So we were really 14 inquiries in one, which, if you've got any legal training, background experience, that is a beast in and of itself, and was a tremendous challenge. But it was essential, particularly because the institutions that we had to look at were not only federal institutions, that they were also provincial. We were given a 2.5-year mandate. It was extended by about 6 months. So in total, it was 3 years. We concluded our mandate in June of 2019. In that same month, in June, on the 3rd, we released our final report, which is titled Reclaiming Power in Place, the final report of the National Inquiry. The mandate of the inquiry, well, first, the inquiry came out of years of advocacy from frontline grassroots Indigenous women. And I think that is really important to acknowledge, because for many, many institutions and levels of government, including Indigenous governments, it wasn't a priority. The extreme rates of violence, rates of disappearances, murders, many of which reached national attention through what was happening in the downtown east side of Vancouver and the trial of the serial murderer there, whose name I'm not going to repeat. He doesn't need more airtime. And then the murders in Winnipeg, and the discovery of Tina Fontaine's body. All these brought the issue to national attention. But it had been on the radar for decades, maybe even centuries, and Denise will speak to this. And it was only until some really horrific events forced national attention to this issue that it became a election campaign issue. And the inquiry, being one of the promises of the Liberal government, it was given life and opportunity. The mandate was incredibly broad. We were asked to investigate and report on the systemic causes of all forms of violence against Indigenous women and girls, including social, economic, cultural, institutional, and historic causes that contribute to the violence. We were also asked to look at institutional policies and practices that are effective in reducing the rates of violence. We were asked to put forward concrete and effective solutions that could help address and remove these systemic causes. We were also asked in our mandate to identify ways to honor and commemorate those that had been lost. The work was enormous and it was monumental. I often feel like we got to really look at the tip of the iceberg, quite frankly, when I reflect on our work. And our work, the outcome of our work was 3 large volumes of text, as well as supplementary reports, and an enormous record of testimonies, and those are still available online. We heard from thousands of family members and survivors that shared with us their experience. We also heard from various institutions and grassroots organizations on some key issues. I'm not going to get into that. The reports are quite comprehensive, and I encourage you all to read them and engage in a learning exercise from the reports. Our goal was really to make sure that the report was not in the voice of the 4 commissioners, that it was in the voice of those who shared with us their wisdom, their experiences, and their dreams, quite frankly. What we came to understand, and I think that this is the sort of the 4 pathways of violence that I think inform and underpin many of our calls to justice. These 4 pathways that maintain the violence are key things to understand, and I'll share with those with you a little bit today. The impacts of colonial violence in the history of the Canadian state and colonial forces have left such a tremendous footprint of trauma, complex, multi-generational, intergenerational trauma. This disruption of Indigenous communities, Indigenous culture, language, social structures, institutions, as well as the individual acts of violence and human rights and Indigenous rights violations have left such a harm. And one of the ways in terms of how the violence continues is by not addressing that. Another area where I think that is one of the root causes and why the violence continues is issues around economic and social marginalization, particularly of Indigenous women and girls. The third, very much tied to that, is the failure to respect the agency and the political rights of Indigenous women and girls and Indigenous people more generally. So you've got a dynamic where Indigenous women and girls in this country, as well as their communities, who are economically and socially marginalized and who are politically oppressed, and that continues. The fourth one, and this is the biggest one, and I think where we have to have conversations, particularly as non-Indigenous people, is the lack of political and institutional will to address these issues. Those were what we came to understand as what I call the 4 pathways. We also made numerous findings of facts that I think are really important and interesting, but I'm not going to get into them too much because I want to focus on the way forward. I also want to leave it to discussion. When I reflect on what has happened recently, we hit the 4-year mark since we released our report. When our roles were concluded at the end of June in 2019, it was sort of like Cinderella at midnight. We all just went back to who we were before. Yet we all carried eagle feathers that were gifted to us at the beginning, as well as the truths shared with us by families and survivors and elders and people within the community that, you hold with you for life. And what do you do with that next? So as a former commissioner, it's been quite challenging when it was all said and done to then sit and watch. And that's really what we've been left to do, is sit and watch what our federal government and the various provinces and territories, as well as municipalities across the country, as well as Indigenous governments, what they were going to do with what they could now no longer claim to know nothing about. Not only was there a record of the truth, there was concrete actions and suggested actions through our recommendations that could guide them. We referred to our recommendations all because it really didn't fit, but in terms of describing them as a recommendation, there many of them, because we looked at the work and we looked at the realities and what needed to be done through a human rights and a rights-based lens. Much of what needs to be done is actually legal imperatives. Upholding the human rights of Indigenous women, it's not like a cute ask. It's actually legal principles that underpin it. Legal principles that are founded in not only Canadian law, but also international law and principles. So we looked at what we wanted to recommend and recognize that recommendation was too weak of a term. So we landed on calls for justice. And we really do see those calls for justice as being a framework of how the various systemic elements of the violence against Indigenous women and girls can be addressed, but also as tools to look at how we create a society in Canada where Indigenous women and girls and gender diverse peoples and their communities can live lives, dignified lives, where their rights, human rights and their Indigenous rights, both inherent and treaty, are upheld, respected, and where they can live and flourish. I'm going to leave it at that. I would really like to cater what I share with you based on some of the questions that you have, and I would really like to end now because I think that it is the wisdom from elders and like Patty, as well as the lived experience of Denise and her continued leadership that I think needs to guide the next conversation.
Thank you so much, Kaya. Wow. And we'll everyone please save your questions either in the chat or remind them, remember them for after we hear from Denise and Patsy. And thank you, Denise, for coming. It was Kaya who connected us with Denise because Denise was a member of the National Family and Survivors Circle for the National Inquiry. And Denise fought for years for justice for her mother, Annie Mae Pictou Aquash, who was a prominent American Indian movement activist who was assassinated in 1975. And Denise went on to be a community liaison officer for the commission, and she's been instrumental in some of the implementation. So Denise, as you know, as Kaya said, from your lived experience and your experience with the commission and your perspective on implementation, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Wilalin. Nin de Louise, Denise Pictou Maloney. I'm coming to you live from Mi'kma'ki. Where I live, play, and thrive in Chibuktuk, also known as Halifax, Nova Scotia. Very humbled and pleased to be with you today to share some of my lived experience. As our good friend Suzanne has already stated, I am a family survivor. I lost my mom when I was the age of 10 years old. And she was the center of our universe. In those short 10 years, she shared so much wisdom with my sister and I, and really how to conduct ourselves as good citizens, good human beings, and encouraged us always to speak the truth. Her last words to me before she was executed was during a visit that she had with us in our province, in our territory of Mi'kma'ki. She had gone through the night and had smuggled herself into Canada from the United States. She was wanted by the FBI at the time. She was on one of the top 10 most wanted in America at the time, if you can believe, because of her activism with the American Indian movement. But when you hear that she was wanted for what they thought, were such sinister activities, it wasn't her that they were looking for. It was for the other members of the American Indian movement, because they were the ones that actually ended up executing her. But her last three words to us were, or last three expressions were, to always tell the truth. Don't ever lie. Don't ever let anyone tell you that they are better than you are, that we are all created equally. And she told me, because I was the eldest of her two babies, to look after your sister. She said, look after your sister. Of course, as a 10-year-old, you take that to the bank. You're thinking, great, I get to be the boss. But those were all, kind of in a very prophecy way. I think she knew things weren't going to end well for her. And those were some of the wisdom that she felt. And I can tell you how those three things carried me for the rest of my life in our journey in trying to fight for justice for her. Is where I draw my strength from, where I draw my courage from. I just want to preface this conversation, as questions are going to come afterwards, that I really want to encourage, and my goal when I have these conversations is to create brave and courageous spaces where people can feel quite safe and comfortable to ask any question, no matter what, how, if you're worried. I've done this for, sadly, I'd like to say, short time, but it's not. I've done this for most of my life in speaking and advocating for her justice. It is the defense mechanism that I'm able to detach myself, and grow a thick skin in doing this work, because you have to. It is not for the faint of heart. Every day that I have to defend my mother in her right to have her life has been challenged by institutional barriers, by policies, by protocols, by the way our society is set up and how our women are constantly canceled, and where we are lost in not having that value as matriarchs in our own territories. And our territory, we are matrilineal. Our women are the core in the center. We are the givers of the next 7 generations. One of the reasons I agreed to come and work with the National Inquiry is because we had been out on the field advocating for decades before any of the advocacy groups existed. Amnesty International didn't exist. NWAC didn't exist. AFN didn't exist. We were out on the ground pounding the pavement in the early 80s trying to find answers to what happened to my mother. Multiple letters being written around jurisdiction. And thank you for acknowledging that earlier and saying that these challenges were happening in 1975 and they're still happening today. So the formula is the same. There has not been a lot change in legislation and how Indigenous women are valued in this country, or how they are prioritized in this country, or in any continent, to tell you the truth. North America as well. The United States is just as neglectful as Canada has been with their Indigenous women. My mother was executed for speaking the truth. She was a strong women's rights advocate. She spoke about, the value and the equity that our women should have in a time when misogyny and patriarchy were the norm, where it was normal to slap a woman into silence. My mother would get engaged in the middle of a domestic, event to protect her sisters. And she was targeted for that because they knew that she was a troublemaker because she would speak up and defend other women. Her telling me to look after my sister, I took that as all sisters. So that's what carries me to speak and to continue speaking. I'm asked often, why do I continue doing this work? It's because I still see it happening. It's still existing right today. I'm glad that you had that experience to imagine what it would be like if we were to take the Indigenous component out of it and put it just as a gender-based women's issue, that overnight it would be 20,000 women, Canadians, that would be missing and murdered. And when you think of the enormity of that, that kind of puts it into perspective of where we're coming from when we look at the statistics of how quickly we go missing and murdered. I have to say that the opportunity to speak at the National Inquiry, to work and to be engaged was something that I had never seen offered in this country in any of the years that we had been on the ground for probably about 25 years advocating for justice. I had tried to get engaged with Amnesty International. I had tried to get engaged with the Assembly of First Nations. I had tried to get engaged with the National Women's Association of Canada. The challenge is that they had so much moral ambiguity. They were promoting and protecting violent men while they were trying to advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. And if you know anything about victimization, that is an amazing gag order that keeps women quiet from coming and stepping forward. There's a risk to safety. You don't feel safe in complaining or putting your issues on the table if they're supporting violent men. So for many years, our family was neglected. And as a matter of fact, probably one of the worst cases in Canada for neglect, institutional neglect. We did not have any support. We had to engage in 4 trials. We didn't have anyone that stepped up with us. We didn't have anybody that made sure we made it to trial and back. Those 4 trials ended up in 2 convictions, a guilty plea and an acquittal. So we have my mother's murderers in prison. Ironically, last year, maybe about this time, I got a letter saying that our Minister Lametti was looking to try and find a technical issue, or I wouldn't say an issue, but they were trying to find a technicality that would free the man that shot my mom. His defense lawyers were writing letters to our minister. So here we were, even though he's been in prison for 12 years, having to once again relive that horror of having to advocate. And I'm writing letters to Minister Lametti, asking him not to look at freeing this man because of a technicality based on his identity. One of the things that the National Inquiry provided families was a safe space without having to worry about repercussions to speak their truth. Agencies and organizations in this country are set up to fail. I will say this confidently as a family member because I've lived it, I've seen it. They are giving limited funds, limited resources with no skill set, no training to support trauma and to support families who regularly are victimized and pathologized for trying to speak out and who are often, left in deficit when they do engage with organizations. They don't have mechanisms to support them holistically to make sure that they have that healing or that grounding. The National Inquiry for our family was the first time ever I saw that aftercare happen, ever. And I had been engaged in a lot of attempts to try and have our voice heard over almost 3 decades. It was 28 years we were advocating for justice for my mom. It provided a safe space that we could intergenerationally acknowledge the harm and the loss. It created an autonomous platform for families to be able to come, share their truth unconditionally without having to worry about organizations icing you out or excluding you from further engagement, because that's what it comes down to is unfortunately a lot of nepotism, a lot of favoritism. And it's not done intentionally. I just want to be clear, this is an attack on the organizations out there. It's done because they don't have the resources to do it. And they've become very accustomed to a system of service that is not serving those that it's intended for. Most of the time because they're not doing the research and they're not doing the reach out to those people that are most impacted. A lot of it is governed by their own authority and what they think is best for families. The other reason that I was so entrenched and appreciative of the National Inquiry and their structure is because they did come to us and they asked us. As Kaya mentioned earlier, she took her guidance. And I remember being on the road with all 4 commissioners. They would come to us regularly as part of the National Family Advisory Circle. They would come to us and say, what does the families feel would be the best approach? What are the best practices in doing this work? What do you need? Simple things like we want to have elders, we want to have access to our traditional cultural ways of being while we're on the road and sharing such deep, intense, painful memories and experiences. And they provided that. And I myself in my role today, I work at a local college. I'm the senior advisor Mi'kmaq Indigenous initiatives in the province here for one of our biggest colleges. It is how I now advise the college. Center students, center those you're doing the work for, making sure that it's sanctioned by community so that you have that wraparound support and you have those tethers to community so that you are guided and you don't have governing agencies deciding their authority what's best for people who are most impacted. When you don't do that, it doesn't matter the intention. If you don't have a way of measuring the impact on those that you're trying to serve, you are always going to fall short of your goal. You're always going to miss the full target. You know, there were a lot of challenges in doing this work with the national inquiry because institutions had gotten really used to a line of resources and a line of acknowledgement and a line of authority for generations of being the experts in these fields. But despite all the efforts, despite all the financial commitments, our women and girls were still going missing and murdered. So we needed to find out why was this still happening with billions of dollars being invested in missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. Why were the numbers not stopping? And it had a lot to do with they didn't talk to the people who were the people suffering the most. They were not talking to those that were impacted the most by the issue of MMIWG. We have 231 calls to justice that were created out of that national inquiry. People will think, oh, these are recommendations the government put out. No, actually, these are 231 legal imperatives that families made as recommendations, that families have said, this is what we need to heal. This is what we need to feel like we have justice. This is what we need to feel valued in this great country of Canada. And yet here we are 4 years later, struggling to implement those 231 calls to justice. And most of it because it has become a game of politics and budgets. And when you have finance and governance, finance and politics governing human rights and equity, you are always going to lose. You're never going to achieve your goals. So as we struggle to try, you know, Italia did a little work for us when we were trying to implement the 231 calls for justice. I do sit on the National Family Survivor Circle right now, which is kind of in flux as they're trying to find their way of how they're going to be going forward. But advising the minister for 4 years, you know, I was like a parrot. I would not stop talking about the ombudsperson because we can have all of these great intentions, and if we don't have a way of measuring and of accountability to make sure that these 231 calls for justice are implemented in the right way and done through with centering families, again, we're going to be missing the mark. So I had the opportunity to testify at the Senate about a year ago to really express how important it is. Maybe 2 years ago now, I'm losing time because of everything that's been going on. But 2 years ago, I had a chance to testify at Senate to really nail home why it was important to implement Call for Justice 1.7. Because I felt like we were kind of on a little bit of a Ferris wheel of just doing the same things over and over again with no real accountability, no real plan of what's next. You know, we all knew we had this enormous task of implementing the 231s, and then the question comes, as always, who's going to do it? You know, you have the province pointing at the feds pointing at the province, territories in the middle. It just became a game of pointing who's going to do the heavy lifting without any of them and all of them realizing that it's shared lifting that has to happen. And that, yes, it's about having accomplices. It's about having people that can come up and say, you know what, why are we going to wait for people who have been so deeply impacted by harm to come up with the solutions of a design of a country's values that were created by the country? And I could never understand why that was something that the government continuously kept saying, well, what do you think the solutions are? I said, I cannot give you solutions to your genocide. I cannot give you solutions to your oppression. I didn't create it. I can flag it. I can tell you it's here. I can tell you how it's here. But you are the one with the power to be able to create that solution. And and I still struggle with it today, because these are the conversations I have at these tables, you know, when they come for solutions. I'm like, well, you're the one holding the purse, you're the one holding all the power. Here's what we're advising, and you have 231 calls to justice that are already there. You just need to implement them. And I think that there really has to be a wider call out by general Canadians to start saying, what are you doing about this? The amount of money that was invested in this and that continuously gets invested is just absolutely mind-numbing to me, that they have not moved in this. And I think really myself, I want to empower women in this country, because this is about gender-based violence. Yes, Indigenous, but it still impacts our women. It is something that we can all relate to. And I can say that all of you, with your positions and your authority in the spaces that do exist, to rise up and to be able to speak to this and say, you know what, I would want a return. I would want a return on my investment if I was investing in this, because I am telling you that women and girls in this country are still at grave risk. We are still going missing and murdered. The numbers have not declined. If anything, they have increased, specifically over the last 4 years with the pandemic and with some of the social stuff that's happening south of the border. People feel quite incensed to be able to behave and to do what they feel with Indigenous women and girls. And I do believe I want to provide some time for questions. So I'm not going to go too much further, but just to talk about our experience, where we're at, where I would hopefully get to one day, and having people rise up and really encourage people to make this a socialist issue and not so much a medical model anymore, that we need to you know, really empower our Indigenous women to be able to rise and to safely in your state. So thank you, Willalin, for the time.
Thank you, Denise, for sharing from your painful experience. And I admire your perseverance. And we will have time to discuss after our next presenter. And my name is Gertrude Hocke, and I'm, as Suzanne mentioned at the beginning, the governor of Eastern Canada region Seroptimus. My home is in London, Ontario, and I would like to acknowledge that we are located on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Lenape, and the Oneida nations. This land continues to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. And as Seroptimists, it grieves us deeply that women and girls from our Indigenous sisters suffer and experience violence. And we firmly believe that achieving justice is imperative. And therefore we had this webinar organized. And now it is my honor to turn the spotlight to Patsy Whitefoot. She was raised in Medicine Valley and White Swan in Washington State by her maternal grandparents in the Indigenous homelands of the Yakama Nation. Early education in the traditional life ways provided a foundation that continues in her work and with her students, grandchildren, and peers. As a traditional food gatherer, Patsy is a member of the Tapanish Creek Longhouse, where tribal practices are sustained. In the perpetuation of her tribe's inherent rights, Patsy advocates in support of sovereignty and treaty rights through community mobilization, voting rights, health and welfare issues, civic education, and is committed to addressing the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis. Mrs. Whitefoot has served in election positions of the tribe with the Code of Ethics Board and Yakama Tribal Council. She also serves on the National Indigenous Women's Resource Center as a murdered and missing Indigenous women family advisor, and the Federal Not Invisible Act Commission in addressing the missing and murdered Indigenous women and peoples. With her early foundation in her tribe's Indigenous ways of knowing, she was prepared to pursue a BA in education with a teaching certificate at Central Washington University and a Master of Education. and a 45-year career in managing and teaching from early childhood to adult education. She has served previously as the National Indian Education Association president and currently serves as the second vice president. Mrs. Whitefoot was also honored to be appointed by President Obama to the National Advisory Council on Indian Education with the US Department of Education. She was also appointed by Secretary Sebelius to the US Department of Health and Human Services, Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration Prevention Committee. Patsy is especially committed to her role with the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, where she has previously served on the executive board and currently serves as the Education Committee chair of 25 years. She continues to reside on her ancestral homeland and has 3 adult children and feels blessed to be the grandmother of 10 and the great-grandmother of 3. Patsy is a prominent advocate for missing and murdered Indigenous women and Indigenous rights. She is part of an Indigenous team that produced podcasts called War Cry, in which they explore stories, issues, and historical connections about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And I think this especially helps to get the message out to the wider community. Patsy, thank you for joining us today and sharing your experience and rich knowledge with us.
Thank you, Shikmaitsky, Inknashwinik Shashtwapit, Ku Pashtan Wiki, Patricia Whitefoot. I just shared in our language of the Yakama people and the Plateau tribes here in the Northwest. Greetings to all of you. And I shared my English name and my Indigenous name as well with you. I want to say I really appreciate the 2 presentations that were shared early by Kaya and Denise. Thank you so much. I learned a lot just listening to you. And I just also want to thank the Canadian family for inviting me. I feel like I'm a guest here, so really want to just acknowledge your role and leadership in providing this session. Thank you. I also have a PowerPoint that I want to share with you. As you heard, I'm also have been an educator, and so I'm always happy to share, particularly with teachers and students, about the work that's going on. And I want to be able to talk about a land dispossession, the boarding schools, and in your case, I understand they're called the residential schools, and the MMIWG crisis here in the United States. And similar to the work that's been going on in Canada with First Nations, we are also undergoing similar circumstances here in the United States. So to begin with, I just want to, can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Yes,
Okay,
we can
thank
see
you.
it in small.
Oh, small. Okay, let me see if I can get it up. Let's see, how do I do that now? I know there's a way to do it.
If you click on at the bottom, yes, there is yes, just go to the left. You
Yeah,
can
I
see a
see it.
screen. Yep, no, there is a screen.
Oh, okay, right there.
Yes, no, there is a screen where you have your cursor a little to the left. Yeah, a little to the right. The one next to it. If you just
Okay,
go,
let me just,
yes, you were right, Just
okay, let me move it so I can see it, first of all. Okay,
you're almost there, yeah.
I know I've got to be able to see it. So the first one, okay. To the right, there you go. Thank you very much. I see it now. Uh-oh, it didn't do it. Oh, what in the world?
If you go up to the very top, you'll see slideshow. If you go up to the top of your PowerPoint screen, you see
Okay,
the word slideshow.
yes,
If you click on that, and go play from the beginning. Go over to the over to your right.
Okay, I've
It
done
says
this before. I
play-
don't know why I
No,
can't.
no,
Let
keep
me
going.
try it this way.
Okay.
There. Is that better? Can you see it now?
It's
Yeah.
not full screen, but it is something we can see.
Okay.
Take your
all right.
cursor to the left side where it says from beginning,
From beginning.
right under
yes.
file,
Oh, okay,
and click there.
okay.
Click
I've
right
never
there.
That's
There.
the one.
Good.
Okay, I've never done it that way. Every time I do this, I'm always doing it in a different way. So thank you for your help. I appreciate it. And so this isn't the Columbia River, which extends from Canada, of course, and comes down into the Northwest area, cutting through the state of Washington and then going through Washington and Oregon here in the Northwest. But it's those tributaries that are important as well, because this is where many of our tribal people live and reside today. And of course, like many of our relatives in the North, we are a fishing community, which we're very involved with today. And I also just want to cite, the work that has been going on with Indigenous peoples at the United Nations. So, oh dear, what did I do now? Okay, so I think it's important to point out that that people have been coming together for many years to declare rights of Indigenous people. And so basically it states that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. And by virtue of that right, we're able to freely determine our political status and freely pursue our economic, social, and cultural development. And I've also been involved with the National Congress of American Indians, which is made up of our tribal leadership. And there was a recent call that tribal nations should also be following this work that's being done at the international level as well. And because I've been a teacher in the classroom, it's information that I share not only with students, but also with teachers as well who are teaching our young people. And then I have the map here of primarily the Northwest. You heard earlier that I have been on the executive board of the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians, which is made up of 57 tribes here in the Northwest, which includes Southern Alaska, and then the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, Western Montana, Nevada area, Northern California. So this is the role of the river systems are important, and the tributaries and the land base were all interrelated in one way or another, including our relatives that are in Canada as well. So I just wanted to say I greeted you in our language, and I also shared this introduction recently with the U.S. Department of Interior, Deb Hallen, who was also taking testimony regarding the Healing and Reconciliation Commission for Native American boarding schools or residential schools, and those hearings are ongoing today. And just wanted to share, I was raised by my grandparents on the Yakima Reservation, and part of my education included, and my family's was included our relationship with the Fort Simcoe Military School. And then at age 6, I was at the Yakima Mission, which are located in the community of White Swan. And White Swan is on the Yakima Reservation, and it's a very heavy populated rural remote community, and it's populated primarily by Yakima tribal people, and it's a large community. However, over years, the population demographics have changed, and so we're again going through major changes in the community. And for me personally, I live about 3-4 miles away from the Fort Simcoe Military School where my grandmother was and other family members were. And I share the role of my grandparents because they were the ones that raised my siblings and I, with also some of the years that we spent at the Yakima Mission, which was located again about 4 miles to the east of me. So not too long ago, I came to the realization that institutions that have impacted my life and my siblings' life, what has been impacted by these two institutions. So just a little history. I'm part of the Treaty of 1855 with the Plateau tribes. When I say plateau, I mean not only the Yakima Nation, we're one of the largest tribes in the western part of the United States. We're also interrelated with the Warm Springs tribe in the state of Oregon, the Umatilla tribe in the state of Oregon, and also the Nez Perce tribe in the state of Idaho. And so this interrelationship is extensive and broad. And so it's important to understand that simply because we live in one area doesn't mean that we aren't connected to, our Indigenous relatives and family members in other states. And so we find ourselves facing jurisdictional issues, as I know Tammy Ayre shared the last time. And the impact of when the land was being settled. Of course, there would be encroachment in our lands in 1855. And also in that year was a time when, in that year, we've highlighted the fact on our podcast is when our women were also being impacted as well, with rape and murder too, particularly with people coming onto the land. And so I'm certain it was prior to 1855, but what we did through our podcast was be able to cite the fact that a woman and her child was murdered by the gold miners. So of course, then war breaks out as a result of that. And so it's a period of time that we went through in our life. And there's a lot of history that relates to the war that I speak to. And I'll just give, one example. My grandmother would say, never tell people that you're a part of this band or tribe. In this case, it was the Klickitat, which is a band that I'm not. I'm not just Yakima, but I have also descendancy amongst other tribes. And I came to realize later in life that the reason she said that was because the Klickitats were part of the tribal, the tribe that had been in war with the settlers or with also the government of the Northwest. And so the war escalated, and not only in the Seattle area, but also it came down to the Nisqually area. And there's a whole history about the war. And then it goes over to the Spokane area in the eastern part of the state. And so that moves us then to the need for our children who were going to be the ones that were going to be salvaged, to take the education and to take the wildness by removing the children from our families. And I share that because it's important, because that's something that happened to me and my siblings. But also here's the military school, and it was so militarized. And there's a whole history that I've researched about the role of the military school. And basically the intent was to assimilate the children in one way. And you may have heard this already about my grandmother speaking about her long hair being cut, and Indian names were discarded, and Christian names, it became a part of the norm for these schools, and they attended churches regularly. And my grandmother would speak to the fact that when she spoke her language, the children would be whipped, or her mouth would be washed out with lye. And so when we think about all of this, this trauma that our people faced, and even our parents and grandparents and ancestors, that trauma continues to live on in our lives today. And there's one that I cite. This was in a book that Dr. Denise LaJamarder shared about a young girl at the Chemawa Indian School in Oregon. So the child says, I was 4 years old, or the adult then says, I was 4 years old when stolen and taken to Chemawa, Oregon, where the matron grabbed me and my sister, stripped off our clothes, laid us in the trough and scrubbed our genitals with lye soap, yelling at us that we were filthy savages, dirty. And I had to walk on my tiptoes screaming in pain. And so when we think about these types of atrocities, and they're not spoken about over years, until in many years, when in some cases, as I begin to understand the experience of my grandmother, then I began to understand her behavior toward me. And then to have me then go into a similar situation and my siblings go into a similar situations, we really have to take a critical look at the history toward Native people. And here in the United States, there were many congressional laws that were passed regarding Native people, and the more interesting one, or the emphasis one, has been on the Dawes Act to isolate Indians by creating Indians as farmers on our reservation. And so what this did was fractured our collective tribal land base and isolated us pretty much. And so you go through the years and you see in 1924, that's very recent, we became citizens through the Indian Citizenship Act. And in 1934, we had the Indian Reorganization Act. So what is this historical and trauma about? And here in the United States, there have been numerous studies. And so similar to what was shared about the Canadian and First Nations, it's this intergenerational and historical trauma, which has been compounded by unresolved loss and grief. And that unresolved loss and grief goes back to your elders, in the case of my grandmother. And as a child, witnessing what she went through and listening to what she had to share, we talk about unresolved loss and grief, because I never witnessed her addressing that unresolved loss and grief. And as a child, she had 17 children, and many of her children were impacted, by disease that came in, and the children she lost them to because of their health conditions when they were very, very young. The other significant report is the National Institute of Justice report that says 85%, or 4 in 5 of American Indian Alaska Native have experienced, sexual assault in their lifetime, and cites that 66% of us have experienced psychological aggression by a partner, 56% experience sexual violence, 55% physical violence by an intimate partner, and 48% experience stalking. And, we look at this trauma, and the Native women are saying the missing and murdered Indigenous women go missing not once, but 3 times, once in missing, once in the media, and once in the data. Now, I share this because it's a similar experience that I had in the loss of my sister, Daisy Mae Heath. She was the youngest sister of 6 of us. And she has been missing. She'd been missing over 35 years. And more recently, when she went missing, she was 29 years of age. She lived with me in the community of White Swan on the Yakima Reservation. And she was, in this case, a citizen of the Yakima Nation, but also a descendant of Warm Springs in Oregon, another state. And again, this is information that was shared with the federal database, and also with law enforcement. So when I think about you know, the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, it basically says that Indigenous people have suffered, whoops, I keep doing that, sorry. I'm going too fast here. Okay, have suffered, oh gosh, I got to take my fingers off. Excuse me. Okay. Well, I'm just going to go to the 6-point action plan to reform the current systemic barriers and restore safety of the women. This comes from the work that's being done with the National Indigenous Wellness Research, or I'm sorry, I'm getting organizations mixed up. The National Indian Women's Resource Center. We also have a we also have a Native Indigenous Wellness Research Center that I work with also. So I apologize for getting that confused. So basically, the advocacy work that's being done nationally by the national organization is to restore full authority to protect Indigenous women and full expansion of our special domestic violence criminal jurisdiction for tribal nations. Secondly, is to recognize Native Hawaiians to protect Indigenous women. Third, ensure adequate resources for advocacy and services for Indigenous women, including family violence prevention services funding, remove systemic barriers facing families of MMIW, implement a thorough federal response to MMIW by requiring all federal departments to develop action plans with consultation, and recognize, the final one is recognize that land and women are sacred and interconnected, and requires legislative and policy actions to protect them, from the extractive industries and corporate interests as well. So these are the action plans moving forward. We're still working on them. And the Family Advisory Committee is very actively engaged in this process as well. And so just as I'm beginning to close, just want to say over the years that, with the loss of family members, but also with the murder of family members as well. My sister has been missing, like I said, 35 years. And we've also had family members who've been, particularly women who've been murdered. And so there's a tremendous burden on families, but we have to be able to continue moving forward. And so in this case, that has meant working with students, as you've heard, but also children, and training them. And one of the groups that I've been a part of with our young people is our little swan dancers. And in this case, you see our little swan dancers, the little girl, which is my granddaughter, participating in our longhouse ceremonies, but also in the next one where she's down with her hat on, her hands are out, she's preparing to do the swan dance. You could tell by how she is situated that she's preparing to do the swan dance. And it's through the young girls where education is going on, teaching them to be able to be who they are as a human being, but also be able to learn from the natural world around you as well. In the case of the women in the longhouse, where all the women have their hats, they've been food gathering, and this is the celebration to celebrate the new food gatherers. And so all the women come out and dance behind the children that have been basically initiated into food gathering. And so there is a story that also goes along with our little swan dancers, and it's based on the swan. Because of time, I'm not going to go through it, but this is just like an infographic of current work, part of the work that's going on today. And this is some of our girls who are little swan dancers who are singing. We're singing the Native Women's Warrior Song that we learned from the First Nations. In Canada, we were visited at our longhouse several years ago, and we were gifted the Women's Warrior Song. And basically, we want to continue to uplift the lives, the children's lives as being sacred, and empower our youth in their future by teaching them about their unique identity, and continue to create awareness about the women's warrior song, but where did it come from and how it traveled from Canada to the United States. So the role with the advisory council, I'm losing my voice. I'm going to go quickly through here. Is to uplift the voices of family. And I heard that also with the previous presentations. We also conduct our gatherings by Zoom, and the women come from throughout the United States. Guidance, project development, we're involved in the Restoration magazine by submitting articles, or articles are done about the work that families are involved in. We've been actively involved in legislation regarding the Violence Against Women's Act and other legislation. We participate very heavily in the May 5th Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's National Week of Action, which happens a full week in this country. And we advise on the development of posters and ongoing work. And here's the War Cry podcast of the women who are involved. They're all young women that I've worked with over years. They're much younger than me, and so they call me their elder consultant. But you can go to YouTube and other platforms to be able to find the podcast. The focus is on MMIW in the Northwest and its impact on families and communities. So I already went through some of the highlights. This is, for those of you who may not know, this is Secretary Deb Haaland, who's the Secretary of the Department of Interior. She was formerly with Congress as a representative from New Mexico, and she was in Congress and then transitioned and was appointed by President Biden to the Secretary for the Department of Interior. And because of her work, a lot of this work has been done because of her leadership. And so I always, I like to read books. And so from the 2000 Vine Deloria Jr. Book titled Power in Place, he states that knowledge and understanding ultimately should be the goal of understanding and wisdom. They're intersections of our humanities about reclaiming our truth, justice, and healing toward our collective well-being, and vision of healing. And we do that by making certain we have thriving, successful children, flourishing, healthy lifestyles, stable communities, safe and secure environments. And so again, uplifting the voices of our children toward healing of families. I do have a song, but I'm not going to have that shared because it's quite lengthy, and I'll end there. Thank you. Now, where do I?
Thank you, Patsy.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for allowing me to be a guest with you all.
Stop the screen sharing.
Okay.
It's on the top when you see.
Oh, I see it up there. It moved. I don't know how it moved up there. Okay, there we go.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for giving this overview about the history. And I think it's really great when we think about the situation. You mentioned about your granddaughter at the end, and when we saw the terrible pictures at the beginning. So there is some hope in it, and I'm glad to see that. And from your educational point, I think that's really what you are about. Yes, thank you. And now the floor is open for discussion. And I would like to, if you have a question, please raise your hand. Then I'll see you at the top of the screen and can let you in. Or if you want to put it in the chat, then I would like to ask Suzanne to look into this. Esther Tira.
Thank you very much for the session. I had 2 questions and I put them in the chat. I just wanted to mention that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Satira.
Yes, and as to Tira's first question is my question also, how can we as Seroptimists be accomplices for Indigenous women? And the word accomplice is new today to me, you know, further than ally, and I thank you for that. So what would be some tangible actions that we can take as individuals to be allies and accomplices, and yes, and what could we do as Seroptimists? And I open that to all of you.
I can go
And
first.
Denise, let's start with you.
Okay.
Yes.
Write your congressperson, write your MLA, when you're in front of politicians and ministers and circles of people who have power and authority to make change, ask what they're doing about the MMIWG 231 calls to justice. And really just hold their feet to the fire in their ability, in their positions of power to make change. Seems really like blue sky, but it is as easy as that, as asking when you are in circles with different people and asking how and what are they doing to move that initiative forward or to create that action. Because right now it's all just been designed and planned out, but there's no action to it. So now the next step is to what are you doing to put that into action? So, and it's a big question. It's a lofty question. People won't have answers right away, but you know what? It might make them think about, are we just walking? Are we just talking and not walking? That's what we need to do. How are we walking our talk? So that's the next phase. And really the pressure that is not coming from society is allowing governments and people of authority to sit in limbo because people are not rising up and really flagging the atrocity of what's happening. You know, when you know there's a loss of life that is happening. I've seen this country move at amazing speed, this continent move at incredible speed when there was the pandemic. This is the pandemic that is taking our women's lives. So I would like to see the same effort that was, you know, put into saving masses of people from a virus. You know, the virus here is inequity. So I really, you know, can't express so much how much it is everyone shared lifting and really just asking those difficult and being brave and courageous to say those things when you're in front of people and really hold them accountable to what we voted them in to do. So thank you.
If I
Hey.
may add to that.
Yeah.
Because I think the political will part is such a huge issue, and those who are impacted by this, at least in Canada and in the US, Indigenous population is small. So to create political movement, there needs to be a broader public commitment. So I echo Denise's point in terms of pushing for political accountability and will. I think deep education is really important. I worry that people jump onto hashtag movements, and this isn't going to be fixed by a hashtag movement. It's so much deeper than that. So I think continued education, I think that deep education, and Indigenous people, women have been sharing for a really long time, and there are a lot of resources. The final report is one, but there's more. There was reference to in the comments, one of your members spoke of a book that's coming out. Reading those books, I think, is so important, the lived experience. I don't know what's working with my mouse isn't working. I was trying to get last name King, I think. I acknowledge your post. Those, read them. Don't make Indigenous women and families bear this burden and it not be taken up. I think one of the ideas, sort of how you deep educating, sort of getting into that deep education, I've spoken with a lot of groups, law societies that have started book clubs where they started with the final report where they did a chapter a month and then they came together and talked about it. And then talked about it together as non-Indigenous people, include Indigenous people, but it's your responsibility to do that learning. The other thing, when I talk about allyship or being an accomplished, and that disempowerment of Indigenous people is part of the root cause, right? So you have to be very careful that when you're doing the work of allyship, you are doing that in a way where you take the leadership from the Indigenous community. So it'll look different for everybody, but build relationships with the Indigenous grassroots community within your region, within where you are living. Take that lead. In terms of what it looks like for that community, and give your position, your place, your adjacency to other forms of power to the cause. There's this expression, and I think it was former Supreme Court Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, Ruth Gator, RBG, talked about what women want is basically for men to get off the backs of their necks. And I think fundamentally, when we look at the dynamic in Canada and North America generally, we're talking about continued state oppression, and alleviating that is the key part of it, but then also giving Indigenous people the space to get up and do their work, their nation building work, their cultural reclamation, their re-establishment of their institutions of justice, education, health, wellness, lawmaking. Our work as non-Indigenous people is to stop oppressing and giving Indigenous people and making sure they have their space to be self-determining. And that means understanding what they want to do and where they want to go.
Thank you, Gaia. I think we have another question now from Lisa.
I'm from the UK, so I don't know a lot about this, so I might put my big feet everywhere now. So if I do, excuse me, please. When you were talking, I was just thinking, yes, it's about Indigenous women. Sitting in the UK, looking at Europe, women in our courts, European courts, across our countries do not get justice, like you were saying, do not get help afterwards, do not get the proper help in court. So I'm thinking, it's a massive worldwide problem with all women, white women, non-Indigenous women, Black women, all women. And isn't it time that all women in the world got together to stop this? Because it's affecting Indigenous women, but it's all women. And I don't know how you go about that. I know we've got the Stroptomists to do this. We can do things. And do things in my country. We've just got, as it keeps saying, domestic abuse bill. I am happy to write to my parliament, my foreign office, about Indigenous Canadian women, because I think it's time they got the backsides off the ground and had a look. I have friends in the Lords. I'm happy to write to them just to see if somebody will stand above the parapet. I'm happy to join in. But I think it's a worldwide thing and we all need to get together somehow. How, I don't know. I hope I've not put this in. I am absolutely appalled at what has happened to you. And I'm sad it's happened. And I know my country's part of it. And I apologise for that, because maybe some of my relatives are amongst you. I don't know. But I'm sorry it's happened and it's appalling. And what we have now is in this country, we're sending people to Rwanda. It looks like it could happen again and again and again and again. And somehow throughout the world, the entire world, it has to stop. I don't know how we're going to stop it. Sorry, there we go.
Yeah.
Thank you, Lisa. I think Gaia, you wanted to answer?
Yeah, I prosecuted for years, and the failure of justice systems to address violence against women, domestic violence, sexual violence. It's, let's face it, the House of Lords, our courts were designed to protect the wealth of men and to keep their horses and their cows and their houses safe. So fundamentally, this idea of justice from our justice systems as inherited from common law civil system from both Britain and France, as we experience here in Canada, has its holes. What we see in countries where colonization continues, let's face it, the US and Canada are not post-colonial. It's just Britain stopped having the power, right? It was the descendants of the colonial forces that then got the power in the nation state. It wasn't the freeing from colonization that I think countries like India and some African countries, I think, have experienced a different post-colonial understanding and world. What we have here, though, I think, is the intersection of misogyny and colonialism and racism. That is sort of, I think you're right in that this is the shared experience of women subjected to violence worldwide. But in countries where Indigenous women encounter the justice system, there is that added layer of indifference to the point where the violence can happen with impunity, because you then have a justice system and justice system players who, one, the system was not established to protect their rights, but you've also got players who are indifferent and often racist and or feeling and believing that the women are less than. The experience of Indigenous women in sex work and those who are have experienced are homeless, the amount of the records show how indifferent police are, indifferent healthcare is, indifferent social systems are, not just the courts, to a point where they are not cared for, and what has happened to them is characterized as largely being their fault. And I include the media in this. So you're dealing with it's misogyny, it's colonialism, it's racism. And so you can address the court system and try to evolve that, and that has to be done internationally, domestically. And I think continuing as advocates for women's rights, to do that, but always be mindful that there are other elements in the experience of Indigenous women that make it different, that there are additional nuanced considerations that you have to have, and solutions that have to be incorporated. I think that it'd be wonderful if we started learning from Indigenous legal orders that address safety and security of women and children more, because clearly our legal system doesn't come from that foundation. So maybe it's a question of looking at our legal systems that we hold up as being so sacred as maybe we're kind of faulty, and maybe we need to learn from other nations who have protected women and girls better. and start adopting new ways of law, decolonizing our own systems and evolving them.
Thank you. I think the quote Patsy brought about missing, that the women are missing 3 times, once missing, once in the media and once in the data, is just bringing it to the point. Thank you. And Sharon, you have a question?
Yes, I just wanted to bring up your comment about the declaration. Can you shed some insight on the process for the declaration and why it wasn't a convention, which would be more binding on our government than a declaration? A declaration wouldn't be binding at the UN, but a convention would be. That's one question. Just, I was curious about that because I learned about that a while ago, that it wasn't I always thought it was a convention. And second, just a comment you made about educating ourselves. And in the work I've done with Indigenous people, I think it's the non-Indigenous people that really need to have an education on, I know in my work, people are always wanting to help the Indigenous people. And I think many times the Indigenous people know what they need and aren't getting it, but it's the non-Indigenous people that need to have, in many cases, an attitude adjustment by knowledge, because I find the comment, if I hear it again, I mean, I criticize every time I hear it. Can't we just move on? We've identified the problem. Now we want to move on. And, you know, fundamentally, you can't move on until everybody has a chance to be heard and things are happening. So I just make that comment. I whenever I can, I always say, you know, you have to get educated on what's going on, not so much the issues, but what we can do. And that's, if we're advocating for a different cause, we tell everybody we know, because we learn about the issue, we hear the stories through our projects, and then we tell everybody, and people go, oh my gosh, that's got to stop. But we're not doing it on this issue. So anyway, I just make that comment. Thanks.
I appreciate that question, Sharon. With regard to the United Nations, and as I said, a lot of the work I've been doing has been educating myself, because when you're in the public school system, you're pretty much focused on that. And I retired more recently and have been able to do even more work than what I was doing, because I didn't want to do any harm to the students by speaking out, or to the families, because we've had a significant number of Native women and families who've been impacted by, you know, the MMIW in our tribe. With regard to the United Nations, I'm not familiar with the infrastructure of it, but I follow the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And so I'm going to have to now go find out about conventions now. What's the difference here? So thank you. And also in my work with regard to education, I've had to even educate myself, not only, you know, about my sister being missing, but every aspect of her being missed. And I just this past week, I talked with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI, about her case number. And I learned that there are like several case numbers. When we have a state case number, didn't realize we had many case numbers. So my sister wanted a case number and had a long conversation about making certain that whatever her number is, that we're able to keep track of it all, but learned that there's all of these case numbers that are out there in the world. And so just that is one point of clarification for me. Every aspect of, you know, her missing has required me educating myself about that. How do you speak with the police, law enforcement? How do you speak with the FBI? How do you speak with prosecutors? All of that, and then learning more about social services. Every aspect of a woman's life I've tried to learn about, and I listen a great deal, just like I was listening to the conversations from, you know, here this morning. It's just, you're paying attention, my antenna is moving, and I'm paying attention to the questions that are being asked, because there may be something that I didn't know But I agree that, you know, people do want the education. And I do hear, can't you move on? And I'm just going to be blunt and say, no, I'm not going to move on. Even in my own family, I just say, no, I'm not going to. I'm going to continue moving forward, because it's not just my sister, it's about the grandchildren, the granddaughters that are coming up. What about their life and what about the future? Because our families were basically broken in so many ways, but we don't know how to address that brokenness. We have to address all of that aspects of our broken life in order to move on. And for me, it's been small steps, you know, asking for forgiveness, those kinds of things from family members who may no longer be here, and having to go through those whole grieving processes. And it's a process, and every step of the way one has to go through that. And all professions, I think, need to go understand that and go through that as well. So that's about self-education, but also teachers want to know. So I do my professional development with teachers is to talk about these things, because that's what they want to know. They want to know the impact of war on Native people. What was the role of tribal people in these wars? Because the teachers are asking. So I am going to talk about the wars and the good, the bad, and the ugly of what occurred during that time. So thank you.
Thank you, Patsy. Kaya, would you like to add to the question?
You just in terms of the concerns about the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, in terms of I think Patsy talked about in terms of it being really foundational on how we go forward, and respecting the UNDRIP UN Declaration. There has been concern and criticism that the UN Declaration is a declaration rather than a convention, and I don't know why it's that. I can guess that countries did not want to bind themselves, and conventions are precisely that, right? And declarations are a statement of principles rather than a binding agreement. But here's the thing: if you look at the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, that is just principles. If you look at the conventions, human rights conventions, they mirror those a lot. And what the UN Declaration is basically saying is Indigenous people are human beings. Which is sad that that's what has to be said, and that you've got countries that are struggling to say Indigenous people are human beings and have the same rights as human beings because they're human beings. So as a lawyer, I look at that and go, okay, fine, the declaration is a declaration and not a convention, but if you weave it together with declarations, it actually is binding. If you tether it and attach it and recognize it as being closely tied to existing conventions, like the conventions against genocide, the conventions against gender-based violence. The other thing in Canada is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is now law, federal law, which is an interesting thing, and how that'll evolve is also going to be very interesting. I think that the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a really important foundational tool, and the more we can continue to entrench that and enshrine it in our own legal orders, the more we advance our societies to be just and safe places for Indigenous people.
Thank you. And Governor Suzanne, when you asked about things we can do, just for the speakers, we do have status at the ECOSOC status at the United Nations. So this is an area that we could advocate to have our people and delegates speak out when the time comes about the importance of adding language into those discussions.
Thank you for bringing this up, Sharon.
Yeah.
Really important. We have one last question, Lisa. If I could ask you to make it quick, we are over time and would like to wrap it up.
Yeah, I don't know if it's relevant or not to you. I've had rows with our government and the laws. I've changed civil law to criminal law. I've had real carries on. And what I came across, I don't know if it happens in your country, when you're talking about numbers on papers, we're putting numbers on the top of correspondence from government, from the House of Commons. Some of those numbers, a lawyer told me, was not to answer me, not to help me. So when I wrote back and I put that reference on the top, it was going in the bin. So I was told to ask, what is this number for, and what is it about, and why is it there, and please remove it. And that's what was happening. And he got the numbers removed. When he did that, I got help. Sadly to say, I do have a coat of arms, and family one, and I went in the laws and used it. That's how I got help. As a female, I was literally sat on in this country, and that was about 10 years ago, but it still happens today. My mother's brother had to join in because he was male. I did get what I wanted in the end. The law was changed to criminal law. It's still there today. The thing is, you need to ask, what are these numbers and why are they there and what are they for? It might help, I don't know, it helped me. And I still do that today when I write to Parliament, and I make them remove them. And on NHS records as well. There.
Thank you, Lisa. I think we have scratched the first surface of what we can do. And I hope we as Seroptimists get together and help our Indigenous sisters to get forward and work on reconciliation. And at the end of this session, we would like to listen to a song which was created in a prison. And we have Alison Render Brown here. She was instrumental in getting this song and a special painting done. And Alison, if I could ask you to just quickly say something about this beautiful painting and the song.
Yes, with great pleasure. So I join you today very gratefully from the territory of the Nanaimo people. I live on a small island called Gabriola, just off the mainland of British Columbia. I, for many years, worked in the federal and provincial prison system with women and eventually with men as well. And at the time that the serial killer that was active, particularly on the downtown east side, and I agree we won't use his name, I was asked to sit one night with a woman when we were to receive a phone call from the police. I assumed she was getting more charges. She had many, and that was not a big deal. But in fact, it turned out to be the task force on the on the missing women from the downtown east side. And they had phoned late in the evening to tell her that they had found her mother's DNA. And I won't go into any more details about that. I was so appalled at the callousness that this was just a phone call, and that I would soon be made to leave the prison, to leave her alone to deal with this, that I felt that the women needed a way to express and to come together in sisterhood. And so we had a woman from Finland who was wanting to come in and do a concert for the women. And I asked that instead of a concert, would she be prepared to help the women to write a song to express their feelings? And that's the song that you will hear in a minute. And at the same time, about 40 women came together to create this painting to express everything about their lives that they could. And all around the edge and on the back of the painting are the names of women who have been lost in the world of addiction and the sex trade, and not just at the hands of this one man who was just a part of a much bigger issue. So it's the sort of the living legacy of the women, and it came together to support each other as they came to the realization that so many of their sisters had been lost forever. So.
Thank you, Alison. And I will share the screen.
a beautiful butterfly. Spread your wings. Don't say goodbye. Fly away like a beautiful butterfly. Spread your wings. You light the way. Memories of all our sisters are floating in the air. Moments of laughter and tears, loneliness and despair. May their journey be guided with dignity and prayer. Let the angels carry their burdens, the ones that we share. Fly away like a beautiful butterfly. Spread your wings. Don't say goodbye. Fly away like a beautiful butterfly. Spread your wings. You light the way. Briefly knowing their precious smiles while walking these same pain-filled miles. Stolen truth, forbidden lies, tears of anger fill our eyes, knowing that it could have been me, but it was you. Now at last you are free. Now you are free. Fly away like a beautiful butterfly. Spread your wings. Don't say goodbye. Fly away like a beautiful butterfly. Spread